You were born with the city's hum in your ears, neon like wounded daylight bleeding through the curtained room, air-conditioned sighs, and the distant, steady thump of slot machines through poured concrete. The midwife folded your father's palm over your chest and said, half in prayer, half in business, that you would learn to move like a door, open when needed, close without drama. Before you could speak, you understood the sound that would mark your life, the small metallic ring of the service bell at the back of a lobby, and later, the deeper, patient click of revolving glass as the night swallowed another guest whole. If you plan to stay until the end, if you want to know how a man whose trade was invisible could come to carry the weight of other people's lives, subscribe and ring the bell for more stories like this. Leave a like if you feel the small dignity of night work, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next quiet life. It helps keep these stories alive. You learned the job before you learned to read meters or names. Your father, an old bellman with a back like a knotted rope and the smell of rubbing alcohol forever in his sleeve, set you on a crate behind the porte-cochere to watch. He taught with gestures instead of words at first. How to stack a suitcase so the leather did not creak against the wheel. How to tilt your head when a guest offered a coin, to accept kindness and refuse pity. How to let yourself be small so the hotel could be large. He struck your palms once, lightly enough to make the lesson sting and not to bruise. Attention, he said, the only sermon he ever gave. Attention is the coin. Attention keeps people from falling through the cracks. Apprenticeship was hours and hours of repetition. When you were 12, you learned how to roll linen so the seam ran true. At 16, you learned how to hold the brass trolley so that when you pushed it, it rolled like a promise. Your hands, at first too soft, hardened into tools. The skin at the base of your thumbs grew calloused crescents. You kept a nail file in the pocket of your uniform and filed down the edges in the alley behind the valet stand, under the jaundiced light of an exit sign. You learned to read faces in the same way, subtle cues the way other men read tea leaves. A guest's jaw tight, don't press them with small talk. Wandering eyes, ask about nothing, smile. The slight tremor when they removed a ring, ask if they wanted help, because sometimes the tremor meant grief. You were good at the small mechanical truths of the trade. You learned to fix a stuck luggage wheel with a hairpin and a practiced wrist. You could coax a radiator to cough and give heat back without a contractor. But the real lessons were less tangible. Restraint, to hold confidence. Restraint, to not let your hands tremble when a guest lay dying in a suite and you were the only one to find them. Restraint, to fold grief into a neat origami and carry it with the trolley. You learned that doors were both literal and allegorical. Some opened to opportunity, some closed to protect. Some remained ajar, humming with secrets you swore to keep. Night shifted you differently. Nights were long and had their own geometry. Daylight had the arrogance of beginning. Night had the patient commerce of keeping things going. The hotel at night was a living organism composed of small rituals. The valet's final cigarette before the permit office closed. The bartender polishing the same glass until it reflected his own tired face. The maids moving like ghosts between rooms, whispering farewell to the day's perfumes. You fit into that organism like an organ. The bell was your heartbeat, the luggage cart your bones. You moved through corridors with purpose. People mistook you for invisible. You learned to take comfort in the fact. Your first real mistake came in the second winter you were on the night shift. Snow laced the city into something close to silence. A guest in a suite 3 flights up, old as the city itself, a man from earlier prosperity, a veteran of a kind of stage life that blurred fame and ruin, had asked for a trunk to be brought down. The trunk was locked, heavy, and smelled of cedar and cigarette ash. You wheeled it like a priest carrying an offering. The stairwell was slick, the trolley's wheel caught on a worn edge. You hesitated a fraction, thin fraction, and the trunk tipped. It fell, struck the marble, and the lock split open. Inside were dozens of papers, brittle and yellow as old newspaper clippings, and a photograph of a smiling woman with hair like a fan. You had seen grief before, but the photographed smile cut something in you, and you acted without thinking. You grabbed the papers and shoved them back in, closed the trunk as if you could stitch time with a leather strap, and ran. You wrapped the trunk with extra twine and pushed it to the guest's room, and bowed with just enough shame to make your apology quiet and acceptable. The old man did not speak of loss the way other men did. He folded his hands, and for all his accomplishments, his voice sounded like a pen on paper. "Attention," he said, mirroring your father's gospel. "A thing that small can make a life. Do not let small things fall." He did not scold you publicly. He slid a coin across the desk the way a king might slide a territory. He said, "You kept what I left in your hands." That day the city felt both lighter and heavier. You carried the weight of the trunk home like a secret ceremony. In the years that followed, your reputation grew quietly. You were a man who could be trusted with trunks and with timepieces, with thin envelopes and thick, with the last piece of jewelry in a trembling fist. Regulars came to rely on you. A performer, a woman known for a voice like slow sugar, made a point of requesting you, and would whisper something indulgent into your ear. "You listen," she said. "That's why you do it right." Her compliment felt like an extra pocket of light in your uniform. But your world was built on other people's comfort. The hotel's hierarchy was thinly veiled, the glass between those who drank champagne and those who wiped its spill more invisible than any barrier. Managers and owners saw your hours as a cost to be minimized. Patrons saw you as a convenience. The city's glitter claimed its share. You remembered, often and quietly, how your father had bent over a cart and how the old bellman's hands had matched the architecture of the hotel's ribs. You took on apprentices in time. Young men from across the strip learned the gestures and the small mercies. You tried to do what your father had failed to do, teach without the sharpness of punishment. Still, the old ways resurfaced in your voice sometimes. You caught yourself clapping a knuckles-on-wood rhythm to keep a boy's shoulders from slouching, and you remembered the sting of the first cane across your hand, and how it became a lesson burned into the skin. You promised yourself you would be kinder. Yet there were moments the job demanded firmness. There were nights when the wheel refused to roll, and the only language a trainee understood was the force of insistence. There was a night, a year that smelled like too much hot grease from the kitchen. A night when a circuit breaker coughed. It was then that the hotel's artery spasmed and you had your test. A fire, small at first, then greedy, started in a suite where a visiting chef had been experimenting with open flame in a makeshift kitchen. The alarms were slow. The guests were stunned. Smoke woke from beneath doors like a low tide. You were on the 3rd floor when you heard the first scream. This is where craft meets moral freight. You moved as years of habit had molded you. Low, hands steady on the brass railing, eyes on faces rather than flames. You knocked on doors and turned knobs and led men and women into hallways that smelled of singed linen and fear. You cradled a child in one arm that chewed at your uniform, and a woman handed you slippers, then collapsed into your hold like a person who had been hollowed out. The apprentices scattered. Some froze. You threw your body between panic and order. The water system stuttered. The sprinklers whooped cold, and the heat rose in the belly of the building like a living thing. You and the other bellhops organized a line. Guests passed luggage, phones, ashtrays, a checkbook to you and your men, and you ferried them down the stairs in a ritual that was both mechanical and sacred. The trolley boomed like thunder on steps. You did not think of your own lungs as you climbed. You thought in gestures. Who needed blankets? Who needed calm? Who had a name on their lips? You would later cough for months, your chest rattling like loose change. A doctor would write down smoke inhalation, but the ledger of your life recorded the evening as a single continuous decision.
After the fire was damped and the aftersmoke rose like incense at a ruined altar, the hotel's management offered a perfunctory commendation and a free night in a suite for anyone involved. Press came the next day, but your name did not appear in the headlines. The guest list of the celebrities who praised the lobby staff included stylists and producers and the occasional sympathetic celebrity. But it was a grainy photo in the city's small paper that captured you. A shadowed figure beneath a blinking neon sign, hands on a trolley, face hooded in soot. Someone, an editor, an attentive photographer, had noticed the way you carried the child. Recognition arrived in unexpected ways. The old performer with the sugar voice sent you a letter, thin, folded, paper that smelled faintly of lemon from his dressing room. You kept attention, she wrote in a small scrawl. You kept people. That matters. She left season tickets to a show in your name, and the line to claim them threaded weeks long. Not because the tickets were rare, but because the city craved proof that kindness could be seen. Still, time was a cobbler, and it stitched its seams on your body. Night work eroded you in slow, particular ways. Your knees began to remember 10,000 stairs. Your sleep hollowed out into a room full of small dreams interrupted by the toll of elevators. You developed a dry cough that clung like a guest who refused to leave, and on some mornings you woke with hands that tremored, as if the city's constant motion had lodged in your blood and needed to be wrung out. You thought of retirement like a rumor more than a plan. Your paycheck, measured in hourly increments, made no account for the slow collapse of cartilage or dignity. There was no gold watch at the end of your time, only the slow grading of your uniform, from crisp to softened to a kind of acceptance. The apprentices left, some to better hotels, some to different lives, and each departure carved a small notch of loneliness in you. You took on a new apprentice once, a quiet boy with eyes like the bottom of a well, who watched too much and spoke too little. He reminded you of yourself, and something in you hardened and softened at once. You found yourself repeating your father's single sermon, but with a different meaning. Attention, you said to him, is not only the coin, it is the thing you return. There were nights when you took what little pay you could and bought a good cloth and stitched your own hems. The act of mending became a kind of prayer. You learned the exact rhythm to fold a bathrobe so the collar presented like a small, disciplined face. These minor art forms accumulated into a reputation for precision. A samurai of a different kind, thin, well-dressed men with the sort of disposable money that makes the world orbit them,
began to request rooms through you, even arranging to have you fetch their coats with a pretense of necessity. They treated you like an instrument that could be tuned to their mood, and you tuned yourself. You reached a day when your hands could not be trusted to be as steady as they once were. A tremor, at first as subtle as a fly moving along a napkin, blossomed into a traitor shake. It made the careful choreography of the trolley less certain. You learned to double-check knots and to brace your legs like the legs of a table. Once, a delicate porcelain lamp slid from the hand of a guest who had turned suddenly, and your fingers, traitorous, allowed it to tilt. You lunged and caught the shade, but the bulb shattered, sending glass like small stars across the carpet. The guest, a man with the polite features of someone accustomed to being followed by service, looked at you and then at the bellboy at the opposite end, and saw not just the lamp, but something more, the economy of service that allowed his luxury to exist. Word of the tremor spread in the undercurrent of staff conversation. Management began to shift you to lighter duties, for the good of your health, they said. Your pride felt, at first, like a coat left on a chair, warm until someone sat on it, and then it was simply gone. You wanted to resist. The craft within you resisted being told that the work no longer needed your hands. You argued in your head with the tremor, bargaining for one more perfect night. The test came in the form of a commission, an overnight courier job from a visiting philanthropist who entrusted the hotel with a single delicate parcel, a wooden box lacquered black and tied with red twine, sent from a relative abroad. The man asked specifically for you. Some hands hold things better, he said, without irony, as if the world were still governed by small superstitions. You accepted, knowing your hands shook. You thought of the old man's trunk years before, and you aligned yourself as you always had, like a craftsman approaching the moment of tempering. The box was small, the wood warm. It had the weight of intention. You pushed it inwards on the trolley, across the lobby, up a service elevator that smelled of oil and old coin. You felt the tremor, like a small animal underfoot. You gave yourself a new ritual on the way. Breathe in through your nose until the lights blur. Breathe out and imagine the box balanced on the center of your palm, like a coin on the edge of a table. Your steps were deliberate. Then, at the corner of a corridor painted a bland beige to encourage forgetfulness, the lights flickered, an old system, unreliable and moody, and for a second the world became a blur of shadow. In that second, you did what your father had taught you through gentleness rather than blows. You stopped trusting only your hands and let the rest of your body do the work. You braced your shoulders and let the trolley ride against your thighs, cradled the box with your forearms, and in a motion that felt less like saving and more like completing something you had always known how to do, you set it on the bell desk of the philanthropist's suite. The man opened the box and, without fanfare, unfolded a small paper, an envelope with a child's handwriting, and inside the child had drawn a picture of a lighthouse. The man wept, quietly, the sort of grief that is private and absolute. He reached out and squeezed your wrist with fingers that trembled more than yours, and said, "You brought it back to me." News of that night did not travel via press releases. It moved through a different medium, the necessary word of mouth of an old money circle, spoken gently over lunches and in hushed, grateful telephone calls. The philanthropist arranged for your name to be mentioned at a private dinner where city benefactors gave thanks to staff who exceeded expectations. You were given a small certificate and a dinner in the hotel's own closed room afterward. The award was inconsequential in cash value, but enormous in symbolic weight. For a moment, the city acknowledged you in the slight and particular way it had previously only acknowledged entertainers and gamblers. A photograph was taken, you standing awkwardly in a borrowed jacket, the tremor hidden by the angle and the generosity of shadows. For once, the image carried the word attention in it. Your recognition did not cure your body. The tremor continued. Night still felt like work shifting sands. But there was a new thing accruing, respect wrapped in specific gestures. Guests introduced you by your first name when you walked by. A few left small notes on the desk, the kind that said simply, "Thank you for being here." The old ritual of folding robes took on a hollowed sheen. You started to look at the job as more than service. It was a language you had mastered, and you were one of the few literate in it. In the final season of your life, you made careful arrangements. You had no children to foot the next generation's passage, no property beyond the faded apartment above a laundromat. You took pride in leaving a few small bequests: your father's last watch, a stack of carefully folded uniforms for the new apprentice, a collection of small coins from different rooms where patrons had slipped you tips during holidays. You wanted to leave a record that someone had been present in the midnights of the city's life. The end came in a manner that was both quiet and oddly appropriate. You were on duty as usual, on a night that smelled of rain and fryer oil. A guest, a man who had been staying for months, who always asked for a late coffee, and whose face you could place, but whose name remained a mystery, came down to the lobby unsteadily and slumped over the desk. You knelt and felt for a pulse. He was cool under the skin, his breath shallow and a witness to the city's exhaustion.